Hello and welcome to another ranking video. This time I'm doing my first ever ranking of a TV series, that being one of my all-time favorite TV shows, being Stranger Things. And I figured with it being the show's overall 10th anniversary, and along with the fact that Stranger Things has finally come to an end with its 5th and final season, I figured what better way to celebrate the occasion than by doing my ranking of Stranger Things. And without further ado, here's my ranking of all 5 seasons of Stranger Things. Coming in dead last is season 4 of Stranger Things. And before I go any further, just because I say that this is the worst season of Stranger Things does not mean I think it's a bad season. I still think the season's good. It's just my least favorite of the 5 seasons that exist. And before I go into detail in terms of what I don't like about it, I'm going to give praise to what I did like about it. One aspect being the fact that this season did answer a lot of questions I had since season 1, such as how was Will able to communicate to Joyce through the lights? They give an answer to that. Or what happened to the other children at Hopkins' lab that weren't 11 or 8? Again, they give an answer to that. Or what would happen if a human lived in the Upside Down? And we get an answer to that. But it does give rise to some questions that don't get answered, which I'll discuss in a few moments. But several other aspects that I did like is the tone of the season, where compared to the other 3 seasons that came before it, this one is by far the darkest installment of Stranger Things, where the main Vecna plotline really did feel like it took a lot of influence from the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. I mean, Robert Englund, aka Freddy Krueger, does make a cameo in this season, which definitely adds up. And I do feel that the new roster characters ranging from Eddie to Argyle were fun additions to this season. Although I do find it a little disappointing that we never got to see these 2 characters interact with each other. Although that said, I do feel that Argyle is the weakest written character in the entire season of the new characters introduced, because he was a very one-note comical relief character, and while he definitely functioned very well as that, I think he could have been a lot better. Even a character like Dimitri I thought was a nice addition to the show itself. And I also thought he played very well off Jim Hopper's character during that Russian plotline. And I also do think that this season introduced one of its best villains in the form of Jason, which is saying a lot considering the fact that we had the main cast of characters either dealing with Dr. Brenner, the employees of the Hopkins laboratory, to dealing with the various paranormal entities of the Upside Down, the Russians, to even the main villain himself, Vecna. But why I think Jason is the best written villain in the entire show, and why he scares me the most, because to me, he is the most human. The best way I can describe him, he's like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, where he is typically the hero, or someone who sees himself as a hero. But the longer the story progresses, he succumbs to his madness, because he believes what he's doing is for the greater good, even though his actions, as well intended as they are severely misguided. And his entire characterization continues the pattern of Stranger Things deconstructing tropes associated with 1980s pop culture. In this case, comparing Jason to Steve Harrington from season 1 of Stranger Things, in terms of how both of them are a reflection of Tom Cruise during the 1980s. Because when you look at Steve Harrington during the first season of Stranger Things, back when he was still in high school, Steve represents the early Tom Cruise energy, in that sense where he was very human, warm, capable of failing and adjusting, whereas Jason represents the later Tom Cruise energy by being more driven, rigid, locked into a narrative he refuses to question. And what makes him scary is the fact that anybody could turn out like Jason, making him the most realistic villain to exist within the Stranger Things series. But with that all said, what don't I like about this season? Let's start with the plot lines, because my overall enjoyment of a season of Stranger Things really depends on how many of the plot lines did I enjoy. And of the 4 to 5 that concur throughout this season, I only really liked one of them, that being the main storyline revolving around the Hopkins crew trying to protect Eddie while trying to figure out Vecna's endgame, because I felt all the other plot lines to me weren't as engaging, because you have not one but two plot lines revolving around the Russians, with one of them being Joyce and Murray discovering that Jim Hopper's alive and they go on a rescue mission, with the second one being Jim Hopper getting some help from Dmitri trying to escape the Russian prison. And my biggest problem with these two Russian plot lines are that they feel super disjointed from the main Vecna plot line. Sure, season 3 also had two plot lines revolved around the Russians, but even then, those two plot lines in that season still connected with the main narrative, whereas the two Russian plot lines in this season felt like a completely different story unfolding alongside the main one, and contributes very little to the overall season. But at least I remembered those two plot lines, because I felt that the plotline revolved around the California crew when you have Mike, Will, Jonathan, Argyle trying to find 11, to me is the worst one of the bunch, because it was really boring and I didn't really find that one all that engaging. And anytime the season cut back to this plotline, I honestly forgot the California crew plotline was even a thing. Then you have the plotline revolve around 11 trying to regain her powers, which I thought was done fine, which leads into another problem that I have with this season, that being I felt the small town cozy feel of the first 3 seasons was completely gone with this season, because it felt like the Duffer Brothers were trying to make this season very big and grand scale by having all the characters separate in different locations, either across America or across the world. And I just think by going that direction, I think the season bit off more than it could chew. Not only that, but there are some questions that never get answered, like, how did Dr. Brenner survive in season 1, considering the fact that the last we see of him, he gets attacked by a Demogorgon, so him surviving makes no sense. Or how is it possible that the Demogorgon could function alive and outside of the Upside Down when the gate was initially closed? Or how did the Russians get their hands on the mind flare particles? To even having some characters whose fates are left very ambiguous in terms of what became of them, since this is the last time we ever see characters like Argyle and Dmitri, since they don't show up in season 5. And I also felt that the military colonel who was trying to hunt down Eleven throughout the whole season was a poorly written character, because it felt like he was trying to be a parallel to Jason's character, but I felt Jason was a better written character as opposed to the colonel. And his entire reasoning for trying to hunt down Elle to me was very insane. Also, I'm not sure if it's me, but it felt like it took forever for this season to get going. Thankfully, once episode 4 comes around, then that's when the season kicks it into high gear. And for good reason, because episode 4 was not only the best episode of the entire season, but I actually think it's one of the best episodes of the entire series. Overall, I felt that this season was just really over-bloated. Coming in 4th place is Season 2, perhaps the most underappreciated season within the entire franchise, in that sense where this season definitely is very significant in that sense where it introduced a ton of new concepts, characters, and character dynamics that would affect the entire series moving forward. Everything from introducing our main central villain in the form of the Mind Flayer, to introducing several character dynamics that would become a big thing moving forward. Everything from the father-daughter relationship between Hopper and Eleven, to the romantic relationship between Lucas and Max, to the bromance between Dustin and Steve, along with introducing new characters that would also become major parts of the franchise. Everything from Dr. Owens, Max, her older stepbrother Billy, to Murray and the concept of the Demodogs. And I do like how this season was set predominantly around Halloween, so you have a lot of that Halloween flavor throughout the season. So with that all said, why do I put season 2 this low on the ranking list? For me, it comes down to the following reasons. Reason number one, much like season 4, I also think it takes a little while for this season to get going, because much like season 4, I really don't think this season gets going until episode 4. Second, conceptually, having the idea of Will getting possessed by the Mind Flayer on pen and paper sounds like a really intriguing idea for a season of Stranger Things. But I feel like they didn't go far enough with the concept, and I do think the execution could have been handled a lot better. Reason number 3, 11, for literally the majority of the season, does nothing. Sure, within the context of the story, it makes a whole lot of sense for her to do nothing, but still, she just spends her time having cabin fever for 5 episodes and doesn't do anything until the final 2 episodes. Which leads into another problem that I have with season 2, that being the infamous 7th episode, The Lost Sister, an episode that's often considered by many to be one of the worst, if not the worst episode of the entire series. Because the episode in question not only disrupts the pacing and urgency of the cliffhanger from episode 6, and here's the thing, I think this easily could have been fixed if episode 7 came after episode 5. To me, honestly, having it take place after episode 5 would have made a lot more sense, considering the fact that episode 5 is when 11 meets her aunt, and episode 7 literally starts with 11 still at her aunt's house before she leaves to find her sister. Not only that, but the actual episode itself, narratively speaking, felt so disconnected from the rest of the season to a point that it honestly felt more like a backdoor pilot to a Stranger Things spinoff that we never got. Then you have the addition of Billy to be maybe one of the more wasted characters in the entire season, because when you first meet the character, he had a really strong introduction, because the moment he shows up, you literally have Rocket Like a Hurricane playing in the background. In the moment you see his head turn face to camera, it matches up to the lyrics that go, "Here I am." So you think with that kind of introduction, he would be a more significant part of the season. Sure, he does become a bit more of a antagonistic rival to Steve, and we do get the introduction of his abusive relationship towards Max, but I feel like the character himself didn't really do anything to contribute to the plot in the grand scheme of things. Also, moving forward, this would be the season that would cripple Mike's character, because not only did they start making Mike more of a jerk to everyone around him, but he also becomes super useless to the core cast of characters for the remainder of the series. Sure, he does have his moments in season 4, and yeah, he does build the bomb that would destroy the exotic matter in season 5, but it feels like he really doesn't do that much between seasons 2 and 5. Also, his entire character gets reduced greatly because he was the main character of season 1. Then suddenly he just becomes a background character moving forward. So overall, a very important season in regards to introducing new concepts, characters, and character dynamics, but had very flawed writing and pacing issues. Coming in third place is Season 5. And yes, I do know that this season is very flawed, and I will talk about some of the major problems I do have with this season, but the reason why I put this season above seasons 2 and 4, for starters, the story kicks off immediately, where it doesn't waste its time trying to get the story going. First episode, the characters are already on a mission looking for Vecna, and just so happens that on one of their routine scout missions, all hell breaks loose. Not only that, but I do think that this season, narratively speaking, was a good way to bookend the series by repeating the same overall plot structure as season 1 by having a kid, or in this case, a group of kids getting kidnapped by the Demogorgons for Vecna and the Mind Flayer. Also, narratively speaking, it has the large-scale storytelling of season 4, but it remembers the small town cozy feel of the early seasons. And I do like how this season tries to tie up as many loose ends from the early seasons, such as showcasing what became of Kali, or even revealing what the Upside Down is. Although, that all said, there are several plot points that don't get addressed, which I will address in a few minutes. And I do think the last 20 minutes of the final episode, sure, I do think all of the characters have their send-offs were a bit on the safe side. I'm very content with the way their stories concluded. Also, this movie has some really good production values, from really good cinematography. And visually speaking, as far as the special effects are concerned, this is perhaps the best looking season of Stranger Things, to a point that this was no longer a TV show with a movie budget. This season just had a cinematic quality to it, especially that final episode, since it didn't feel like I was watching a episode of a TV show. It legit felt like I was watching a proper movie. I also like how they go in a very different direction in terms of explaining the lore to the main cast of characters, because for the first 4 seasons, anytime you had the main cast of characters dealing with something from the Upside Down, they always compared certain facets of the Upside Down to D&D to better comprehend it. But with this season, they go in a very different direction, where instead of comparing new aspects of the Upside Down to D&D, they decide to compare certain aspects of the Upside Down to the book A Wrinkle in Time to better comprehend the situation that certain characters are in, like having Holly Wheeler explaining the concept of Camazotz from the book to better understand the situation she's in with Max. And speaking of which, I do like the fact that Holly Wheeler is a bit more relevant this season, because for the first 4 seasons, she was nothing more than a background character who did absolutely nothing to the narrative of each season. This here, she's one of the most important characters in the entire season. And it's also nice to have Mike and Nancy either interacting with Holly or even talk about her, because no joke, I sometimes forget Holly Wheeler is even their younger sister. So having her be a major character this season, I thought was a really good direction to go in. And I do like the fact that Will is more active this season, because let's be honest, first 4 seasons, he hasn't done anything. Now sure, season 1 made a lot of sense considering the fact that he was missing for the entire season. Season 2 comes around, yes, he's still a major part of that season, and yes, he's still around for the entire series, and he does help a little here and there, but again, he doesn't really do all that much, since he was nothing more than a puppet for the Mind Flayer. Season 3 and 4 come around, he doesn't do anything. But you fast forward to this season, and he's so much more active. And he also gains powers that play a significant role in helping out the main cast of characters defeating Vecna in some shape or form. Although, that all said, I do have several problems with this season, because even though I think this season started out strong, I do think between episodes 5 and 7, I thought the story dragged a little in some areas, because on the one hand, the stakes are there, but the urgency is very lacking, because there are a few points in time where you have a major action scene going on, where characters' lives are on the line, and the characters stop mid-action scene to have this big emotional conversation with either another character or the entire group, and it really disrupts the urgency of that action scene, killing the momentum of the season. You also have the inclusion of Kali from season 2, and on pen and paper, I do like the fact that she joins the main group in defeating Vecna in some shape or form, but the way they use her in the actual narrative, it didn't feel like she was a big contributing factor to the team. It just felt like the only reason why they put her in this season was to A, wrap up that infamous plot point from season 2, and her only purpose this season was to de-progress Eleven. Because for the first few seasons, it felt like she was going through a really good character arc. But then the moment you reintroduce Kali into the mix in this season, it felt like all that character development gets tossed out the window. And I also don't really like the fact that this season introduced a bunch of new concepts that I wish were better foreshadowed, like the exotic matter, which, yes, technically it was foreshadowed in the first 2 episodes, but I feel like introducing this brand new concept of the exotic matter in terms of what it is and what happens to it when you damage it, I feel that we should have been introduced to this type of concept a few seasons back. Then you have the introduction of the Abyss. Like, yeah, technically we were introduced to it last season, but I felt like we didn't really explore what this place was. Because we spend the first 4 seasons being focused on the Upside Down, that we get introduced to this brand new place where all these Demogorgons and Demobats come from. It just felt like we didn't really have enough time to really explore what the Abyss really is. And speaking of the Upside Down, remember how in the first 2 seasons the Upside Down was a really scary place because not only did we not know anything about it, but anytime we saw characters enter the Upside Down, they always either had to wear a hazmat suit or wear masks around their face to protect themselves from the environment because of how toxic it was. Yet this season, we have the characters wander the Upside Down like they own the place without having to wear any of the protective gear. And you also have the military who build a facility within the Upside Down for some reason. Then you have the actual final episode itself, and even though I really did like the final episode in terms of how it played out, I do have some issues with it. One issue being that I think a few more major characters could have died during this season finale since this is the final episode. And there are some plot points that don't get explained in terms of how they get resolved. Like, what happened to Lyndall Hamilton's character or the military? Because after the Upside Down closes, we have an 18-month time skip and they're just gone. Like, we don't know what happened to them or the project they were working on. Are they still working on it or did they get shut down? We don't know. Or what became of Robin's girlfriend? Because, yes, she does join the party very late into the season and then she just disappears, not to be mentioned again. Or what became of the entire relationship between Dustin and the rest of Hopkins? Because you have to remember, the majority of Hopkins thought Eddie was responsible for all the people died in season 4, and this season literally begins with Dustin trying to revive the Hellfire Club, only for people to really punish him because he's wearing the t-shirt and all that stuff. Yet in the final episode, you have him ripping off his graduation uniform, revealing a t-shirt that says Hellfire Club lives, and people are kind of cheering for that, and I'm just confused. I was like, wait, doesn't the entire town still think Eddie murdered a bunch of people? It just feels like there was something missing there. Honestly, I could go on about all of the problems I had with the final episode, or this final season in general, but I think you get my point. And coming in second place is Season 3 of Stranger Things. And out of all of the seasons of Stranger Things that have been produced, Season 3 to me is the most fun I've had watching a season of Stranger Things. Not only that, but it's also the funniest season of Stranger Things because I found myself laughing more times watching this season than any other season of Stranger Things. I also love the setting in regards to it not only taking place on the 4th of July weekend, where you have a lot of that Independence Day imagery going on, but I also love how a majority of the season takes place in or around the Starcourt Mall and how that plays into the narrative, while also having social commentary showcasing how big, massive shopping plazas like that take away business from these mom and pop stores in town. Also, on top of that, we're also going full Cold War with this season because this is the season that really introduced the Russian plotline, and I thought the Russian plot lines were handled much better in this season than they were in season 4. Because as I mentioned with season 4, even though you had 2 of those plot lines revolving around the Russians, they never really tied into the Vecna storyline, whereas the Russian plot lines in this season, they're a major part of this season. And to add on top of that, the Russians are the main reason why the storyline for this season even happens in the first place. It also took a problem I had with season 2 in regards to the character of Billy and improved upon him by making him one of the central villains of this season by having him serve as the right-hand man to the Mind Flayer, resulted in Billy having a lot more to do in this season. Then you also have the introduction of both Robin and Lucas's sister Erica, who are the standout characters for this season, with Robin serving as a nice foil to Steve Harrington's character. And Erica, on the other hand, she's the scene stealer of the season, because even though she first appeared in season 2, having a very funny cameo that season, this here, she plays a major part in one of the plot lines. And on top of that, I think she is the funniest character in the entire series. And I also do like the visual aesthetics to this season in regards to it embracing the more stereotypical depiction of how most people remember in the 1980s, where this season has bright neon color aesthetics, as opposed to the more neutral color palette of the previous 2 seasons. And I also like how the stakes are immediately raised during the final episode, because in the past 2 seasons, 11 is the only reason why our main cast of characters won at the end of the day, because in season 1, she killed the Demogorgon, along with most of Dr. Brenner's men. Season 2, she closes the gate, which not only kills the Demodogs, but also prevents the Mind Flayer from entering our world. With this season, 11 gets neutralized by the Mind Flayer in the penultimate episode, resulting in her losing her powers. So she's completely useless, and now it's up to everybody else to step things up and save the day. So stakes are raised immediately, but even when they step up to fight the Mind Flayer, it's not enough. Although I do have several problems with this season, one of them being the plotline with Joyce trying to figure out why the magnets aren't working. I didn't think it was as intriguing, but thankfully this plotline disappears very quickly. And I do feel that the beginning of this season, where you have the kids watching Day of the Dead, as I didn't really think it foreshadowed this season the best, because I do feel that with the D&D game at the start of season 1 and the Dig Dug video game at the start of season 2, I thought those 2 pieces of entertainment media that the kids were playing foreshadowed this season pretty well. This one here, you had an intriguing setup with the Mind Flayer possessing people, turning them into an army of zombies. And you would think, okay, between dealing with the Russians and now dealing with an army of humans mind-controlled by the Mind Flayer, stakes are raised immediately. You would think that maybe the Mind Flayer would use some of these possessed humans to go after our main cast of characters, but no such thing happens. Well, at least in a large horde kind of way. And I do feel that Jim Hopper's character, from the writing perspective, suffers the worst here, since his characterization suffers from a severe case of flanderization. Also, within the grand scheme of things, this isn't really that important of a season, as it doesn't really add too much of the way of new concepts or lore to the Stranger Things mythology. But overall, I thought this was a really great season of Stranger Things. And coming in my number 1 spot is, not surprisingly, season 1 of Stranger Things. I mean, what else can I say about this season that has been said already? I mean, season 1 of Stranger Things was pretty much this generation's Star Wars A New Hope, in that sense, where the creators of the show took a lot of inspiration from the type of movies and shows they grew up with from the 80s and decided to take a lot of these familiar elements that we've seen before and decided to mix them together to form something new, resulting in one of the greatest TV shows ever made. Even if this show never continued past the first season is a really solid piece of television that, honestly, if you told me if this was just meant to be a one-off thing, I would have been alright with it, because I just think it's that good. And what makes it good is the fact that the way this story is told was really ambitious, and it worked. Because initially, when the Duffer Brothers pitched this show to different TV networks, a lot of them turned them down because they thought the script was too complicated, or, oh, you need to rewrite to focus on this one aspect. But then Netflix picked it up, and here we are talking about it. Because when you really look at the way the story is structured, each of the main plot lines in of themselves is its own little movie. Where you got the one with Joyce, which plays out like a psychological horror movie. The one with Sheriff Hopper played out like a conspiracy thriller of sorts. Then you got the one with Mike and the kids interacting with Eleven, which plays out like your quintessential a boy and his dog story. And the most surprising of the bunch is the teenager plotline, where it starts out as like this John Hughes rom-com that turns into a 1980s slasher movie. And the type of story being told through these interconnected plot lines is kind of like Tremors in that sense, where you have this small town where nothing happens, but then suddenly the biggest fucking thing happens. And what made this first season so great is the way it handled the answers to certain questions, because there'd be points of time where, depending on what plotline you were watching, you were given a question, and eventually you do get an answer to that question, but for every answer you get, a new revelation takes its place, resulting in even more questions that build on one another. And why this first season had such a great mystery to it, every plotline had a key piece of information that the other plotlines lacked, and only when they came together is when the mystery actually got solved. I mean, let's be honest, this first season was lightning caught in a bottle. And sure, I do think that the weakest aspect of this season was the Demogorgon, and some of the acting from the minor characters such as Steve's friends or the bullies that picked on Mike and friends. Other than that, a near perfect season 2, one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And that is my ranking of all 5 seasons of Stranger Things. Happy 10th anniversary to Stranger Things. And how would you rank all 5 seasons? And see you later.